Why do you get 150 Japanese yen when you exchange just one single US dollar, but only 0.94 euros for that same dollar? Think about that for a second. One piece of paper, two completely different outcomes depending on which country you're standing in. And here's the thing that most people never stop to question. Why isn't $1 just worth one of everything? Why can't we all just agree that every currency equals every other currency and call it a day? The answer to that question is going to completely change the way you think about money, economies, and why some countries feel so much richer than others the moment you land there. So stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand something that the majority of people walking around on this planet have never taken the time to figure out. Let's start with a quick scenario to make this real. Imagine a guy named Dan. Dan lives in the United States, earns his paycheck in US dollars, and decides he wants to travel the world. He packs his bags, hops on a plane, and lands in France. He goes to the currency exchange and swaps his dollars for euros. Then he flies to Japan and does the same thing, this time getting yen. Same guy, same money, completely different amounts depending on where he is. That experience right there is what millions of travelers face every single year, and most of them just accept it without ever understanding why it happens. Today, we're going to fix that. To really understand why currencies have different values, we need to go back in time. And I mean way back. Before money existed, people traded stuff directly. You had chickens, your neighbor had wheat, so you swapped. Simple, right? Well, not really. What if you needed wheat, but your neighbor didn't want chickens? What if your chicken was worth more than the wheat you needed, and there was no way to make change? This system, called bartering, was clunky, inefficient, and had way too many problems. So humanity got creative and started using gold and silver as a universal medium of exchange. Gold was valuable everywhere. It didn't rot, it didn't expire, and everyone agreed it had worth. So it worked beautifully as a form of currency for a very long time. Then nations started forming, governments started taking shape, and those governments started doing something new, printing their own paper money. But here's the smart thing they did early on. That paper money wasn't just random paper. Each bill was backed by actual gold sitting in a vault somewhere. The idea was simple. If you held a dollar, you could theoretically go to the government and exchange it for a specific amount of gold. This was called the gold standard, and it meant that the value of a currency was directly tied to how much gold a country actually had sitting in reserve. More gold meant a stronger, more credible currency. The system worked reasonably well for a while, but then World War II happened, and the world came out of it looking completely different. Economies started growing at a pace nobody had seen before. International trade exploded. Countries were exchanging currencies with each other constantly, and it became increasingly difficult for governments to keep enough gold in their vaults to match all the money they needed to print to keep up with their growing economies. Keeping gold as the backbone of the entire global financial system started to feel like trying to fit the entire ocean into a swimming pool. So countries made a massive shift. They moved away from the gold standard and adopted what we now call fiat money. And this is where things get really interesting. Fiat money is money that isn't backed by any physical commodity. There's no gold vault, there's no silver reserve, there's nothing sitting behind that dollar bill except one very powerful thing: belief. The US dollar has value because people believe it has value. The euro has value because millions of people and businesses trust that it has value. The moment that belief collapses, so does the currency. That might sound a little scary, and honestly, it kind of is. But this system also gives economies incredible flexibility that the gold standard never could. Every single currency in the world today is a fiat currency, and they all operate on the same fundamental principle: supply and demand. Think of currencies like any other product. If everyone wants something, the price goes up. If nobody wants it, the price drops. Currencies work exactly the same way. The more people want a particular currency, the more valuable it becomes. The less people want it, the weaker it gets. And this demand is influenced by a bunch of powerful forces that are constantly pushing and pulling on currencies every single day. Let's break down the biggest ones. The first major factor is interest rates. Now, interest rates are basically the cost of borrowing money in a country. When a country's central bank, like the Federal Reserve in the United States, sets a high interest rate, it means if you borrow money, you have to pay back more. But high interest rates also mean that if you invest money in that country, you get a better return. And that is extremely attractive to foreign investors. Here's how it plays out in the real world. Let's say the United States is offering government bonds with a 10% interest rate. That means if you hand the US government $10,000, they'll pay you back $1,000 every single year for 10 years. That's a great deal. So investors around the world start thinking, I want in on that. But to invest in US government bonds, they need US dollars. So they start buying dollars, and all that buying creates demand, and demand pushes the value of the dollar up. Now flip it around. Suppose the US drops its interest rates, but France is now offering higher returns on its investments. Suddenly, those same investors start selling their dollars and buying euros to invest in France. Less demand for dollars, more demand for euros. The dollar weakens, the euro strengthens. It's this constant global tug of war happening every single day in financial markets. But here's the catch. A country can't just keep cranking up interest rates to infinity to keep its currency strong. Because while high interest rates attract foreign investment, they also make it more expensive for regular people and businesses inside the country to borrow money. When borrowing gets expensive, people spend less, businesses invest less, the economy slows down. So central banks are always walking this tightrope, trying to keep interest rates high enough to attract investment, but low enough to keep the domestic economy humming along. It's an incredibly delicate balance. The second major factor is inflation, and this one affects everyone directly, whether they realize it or not. Inflation is the gradual increase in prices over time. In other words, the same amount of money buys you less stuff than it used to. Think about it this way. Imagine in 2020, you could walk into a store and buy 2 chocolate bars for $5. Fast forward a few years, and that same $5 only gets you 1 chocolate bar. The money didn't disappear, but its purchasing power did. That is inflation in action. When a country experiences high inflation, the value of its currency starts to tank. And the reason is pretty logical. Nobody wants to hold on to a currency that's rapidly losing its ability to buy things. Why would you want to save your money in a currency that's worth less tomorrow than it is today? So people and investors start dumping that currency, which reduces demand even further, which makes the value drop even more. It becomes a vicious cycle. There are lots of reasons inflation can spiral out of control. Bad government policies, economic instability, corruption, and one of the most common culprits, governments just printing way too much money. When you flood a system with more of something, that thing becomes less valuable. It's basic economics. A perfect and extreme example of this is Venezuela. Through a combination of catastrophically poor economic management and political instability, Venezuela's inflation went completely off the rails. At one point, the situation got so bad that $1 US was worth 6 million Venezuelan bolivars. 6 million. The currency had basically become worthless paper, and the government eventually had to scrap it and introduce a new one just to try to reset the system. The third factor that shapes currency value is trade, specifically how much a country exports to the rest of the world. When a country sells its products to other nations, those buyers need to get their hands on that country's currency to pay for the goods. Think about China. China is one of the world's largest exporters. Countries all over the globe buy Chinese products constantly. To pay for those products, buyers need Chinese yuan. All of that purchasing creates massive demand for yuan, which makes it stronger. And China took this even further by making it attractive for foreign companies to open factories on Chinese soil. Those foreign companies need to pay local workers and cover local costs, which means they need even more yuan. All of that activity piles up and adds strength to the currency. Now here's one of the most fascinating pieces of this entire puzzle, and it explains why the US dollar is in a completely different league from every other currency on the planet. Back in the 1970s, the United States struck a deal with major oil-producing nations, including Saudi Arabia. The agreement was that oil, one of the most essential commodities in the entire global economy, would be bought and sold exclusively in US dollars. This was a game-changing moment. It's why the dollar earned the nickname the petrodollar. Think about what this actually means. Japan needs oil. It doesn't matter that Japan isn't buying from America. Japan still has to acquire US dollars first, then use those dollars to pay for the oil. Australia needs oil, same situation. India needs oil, same deal. Every country on Earth that needs crude oil, which is essentially every country on Earth, needs US dollars to buy it. This creates an absolutely enormous and constant global demand for the dollar that no other currency in the world can match. It's one of the biggest reasons the US dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency, and why countries all over the world stockpile dollars in their foreign reserves just to make sure they can participate in global trade. Now let's talk about something called currency pegging, because this is where things get really creative. Some countries, particularly smaller ones with less economic influence, decide that managing their own currency's value is just too risky. The fluctuations are too unpredictable, and investors don't feel confident putting their money into an economy where the currency might swing wildly. So what these countries do is they tie, or peg, their currency to a more stable and powerful currency. Almost always the US dollar. The Bahamas is a great example of this. The Bahamian dollar is pegged directly to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 ratio. And it makes complete sense for them. The Bahamian economy is heavily dependent on tourism, and the majority of tourists visiting the Bahamas come from the United States. By pegging to the dollar, they eliminate any confusion or inconvenience around currency exchange for their biggest group of visitors. They also gain credibility and stability, because the dollar is a trusted, globally recognized currency. Tying the Bahamian dollar to it means that the Bahamian economy benefits from that trust. Even if global economic turbulence hits, the stability of the dollar helps cushion the blow. But there's a real downside to pegging. When a smaller country pegs its currency to the dollar, it essentially gives up control of its own monetary policy. If the U.S. Federal Reserve decides to raise or lower interest rates for reasons that make sense for the American economy, the pegged country has to follow along. Whether it's good for their economy or not, their financial fate becomes tied to someone else's decisions. It's stability in exchange for independence. That trade-off between stability and independence brings us to one of the most interesting experiments. In modern history, the euro. Right now, 20 out of the 27 countries in the European Union use the euro as their official currency. The idea behind a shared currency was genius in its simplicity. If everyone in Europe uses the same money, traveling and trading across borders becomes seamless. No more currency exchange headaches, no more conversion fees, no more price confusion. A French merchant and a German customer can do business without any of that friction. And it works. Travel across the Eurozone and you can use the same bill whether you're in Paris, Berlin, Madrid, or Rome. It makes life significantly easier for both travelers and businesses. But here's where it gets complicated. Not every EU country uses the euro, and there are legitimate reasons for that. Take the Czech Republic, for example. The Czech Republic is an EU member, but they've held onto their own currency, the Czech koruna. Why? Because adopting the euro means surrendering control of your monetary policy to the European Central Bank, which manages the money supply, sets interest rates, and handles inflation for the entire Eurozone. The problem is that the European Central Bank has to make decisions that work across a huge and very diverse group of economies. A policy that's perfect for Germany's massive export-driven economy might be completely wrong for a smaller nation, dealing with its own unique economic challenges. Countries that keep their own currency can respond to local conditions independently. They can adjust their interest rates, they can let their currency devalue slightly to make exports more competitive. They have tools. Once you hand over that control to a central authority, those tools are gone. So it's a genuine dilemma. Shared currency means convenience and stability, but individual currency means flexibility and independence. Different countries have made different choices based on what matters most to their specific situation. Let's pull everything together now because we've covered a lot of ground. The reason different currencies have different values comes down to one core principle: supply and demand. Every currency in the world today is a fiat currency, meaning its value isn't backed by gold or any other physical commodity. Its value is entirely determined by how much people want it and how much of it exists, and that demand is constantly being shaped by a web of interconnected forces. Interest rates drive investment flows across borders, pulling money toward countries offering better returns, and pushing it away from countries offering less. Inflation erodes purchasing power and destroys confidence in a currency when it gets out of control, sending its value into freefall. Trade and exports generate demand for a currency as buyers around the world need to acquire it. To purchase goods. Geopolitical agreements, like the petrodollar system, can lock in structural global demand for a currency for decades, pegging ties smaller economies to more stable currencies, providing security at the cost of independence. And shared currency systems like the euro simplify life across borders, but require countries to give up individual economic control. All of these factors are working simultaneously, constantly shifting, creating the currency values we see every day. That's why when Dan exchanges his dollars for yen, he walks away with 150 of them. That difference isn't random. It's the result of decades of history, economics, policy decisions, trade relationships, and global trust, playing out in real time. The next time you travel somewhere and pull out a foreign bill, that looks almost comically different in size or color from what you're used to, you'll know exactly what's behind it. That piece of paper represents an entire economy's relationship with the world. It represents the trust people have in that country's government, the strength of its trade, the wisdom of its monetary policy, and its place in the global financial order. And honestly, when you think about it that way, it's kind of remarkable that this system works at all. The entire global economy runs on collective belief and trust. No gold, no backing, just the shared agreement that this piece of paper, or increasingly this number on a screen, means something. If this video helped you see money differently, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Because we break down complex topics exactly like this one all the time, making them easy and genuinely interesting for everyone. Drop a comment below telling me which part surprised you the most. Was it the petrodollar deal, the Venezuela situation, the euro trade-off? I read every single comment. Share this with someone who's ever wondered why their money goes further in some countries than others. Because now you actually have the answer. See you in the next one.